quick intro on learning mimics. So this is the segmentation software that you can put radiological images into, such as CT scans or MRI images. Those would be the file extension DCM or DICOM. And for this student version of mimics, you can see that right here, you can use their existing data sets. So when you choose open, you basically have the default install location, which is called med data, and demo files. And these are the roughly the ones you'll get minus like the left arm, because that's our own data set. But you would see pretty much everything else. One of the classic ones is this skull with a hole in it. So we can take a look at that and see how we might do some basic segmentation on a skull. Here's some already completed, so I'm just going to hide those. And I'll hide these masks. Let's just clear it out. All right, so this is the data set as we might see it. Down on the bottom, you'll see a histogram, which is showing us how much of each Hounsfield unit there is in this model. And if we choose this drop-down box and choose bone scale, that's going to give us kind of a default starting point for visualizing kind of the brightness and contrast of these images. Really what what we call window leveling will change is the range of visible Hounsfield units and convert it into gray value. The human eye can only differentiate about 30 different gray values from a brightness level of 0 to 255. And Hounsfield units, if you want to differentiate between something like soft tissues, then you have to kind of reduce that range so that you can differentiate between those soft tissues. And you kind of see soft tissues roughly where you have a bunch of these different spikes kind of in the middle of that histogram. All right, so the first thing we want to do is, for the first step of any segmentation, is really to make a new mask. So on the top here, you'll see a bunch of different tabs. Just go through them really quick so you can see what's in each of them. So the first one we're typically going to start on is the segment tab, and we'll click new mask. What that's going to do is give us the first step of segmentation, which is almost always thresholding. Thresholding is kind of choosing a range of Hounsfield units to say mark those pixels and put those into a mask and call that mask something. So segmentation is really about separating volumes of anatomy by marking pixels on 2D images, and then doing that for all the images, such that we can make a volumetric object from voxels or three-dimensional pixels. And really each of these pixels is kind of like extruded into the thickness of the CT slice, which you can see as I scroll my mouse through the slices. So between each slice, those pixels are kind of interpolated or extruded. And if I click this little icon over here, then it means I can get a 3D preview of what has been selected from this threshold. When I do the default values, that is typically set up for selecting bone, and you can see the bone presets are here. And if this was in Hounsfield units, that would typically be a 226 through the maximum value. But this one is set up in gray value, so you can see the gray value is 1250. Typically, you'd also see these check boxes, either to fill some holes in or to keep the largest piece of that of those. Keep the largest like volume of pixels that are connected to each other. So I could do that, and it would, get rid of these two pieces on the side of the skull, which would be like the table of the CT that a patient's laying on, for example. But also, if I do that, that's going to get rid of any floating pieces of the skull, which I might want to keep, which are inside maybe areas of the thin walls of the orbit, so the sinuses for the skull, but could be important for other anatomies. So I won't do that one, but we'll show you the next basic step of segmentation, which is like using a big brush to kind of get rid of the large pieces that we don't want to see. So that would be this edit masks button. Click that and then choose remove, and lasso would be my my options. And then I can go into the 3D here as long as my buttons toggle there, and I could just circle the areas that I don't want. And that's a really easy way to go around some anatomy and remove chunks of material that's easy to see on 3D if you're doing it all at once. You can see on this skull, there's quite a lot of bone that's not segmented because it's just too, it didn't fall within the Hounsfield unit range that we selected. But you run the risk of, if you went to lower values, you might get too much and you start maybe getting noise on the inside of the skull or the outside of the skull. So that's not good either. So these are typically set up to, those ranges are set up to avoid getting too much noise. So I'll just undo that. So we'll just remove those pieces again. And now the next thing you might do is separate the large pieces of anatomy that are actually separate bones. In this case, we have the cranium as one piece, the mandible as another piece. They're kind of like two pieces, but part of the same anatomy. And then we have part of the first vertebral body, and a little bit of the second vertebral body right here, the dens or the odontoid. So the main tool that we would use to separate those pieces is called split mask. And with the newest version of Mimics, you can actually paint on the 3D object, like where are each of those anatomies, but you can also do it on the 2D. And for the mandible, you might want to do that if the points where those objects are connected are kind of hidden from the outer view. So you can add more regions to this. So you can add like, oh, I have the cranium and the mandible, and maybe I have the spine that I want to separate as big regions. And I would just mark on here to help the computer separate where are those objects separated in space. So I'm going to scroll through and I'm going to help the computer differentiate between each of those pieces. So say A is skull, B is mandible. And I'm marking here the condyles of mandible. Really, you need to do this where those or the pixels are really really touching between those two objects. All right, so that's probably good enough for the computer to figure out where that condyle is. You can do more. You can do like the sagittals and stuff too. But computers is pretty good at figuring out where those things start and stop. And the slices here are pretty thick, so yeah, something like that. And the more overlap you have, probably the more you want to mark. For the skull base, we can, if it's difficult to see on the 2D, we can go to the 3D as well. And the other point is that region A can overwrite regions B and C. So any region can overwrite the mask with the marking that you've done underneath that. So all right, so I think that's okay. It might not get perfect on the spine, but that's okay. I'll just show you how the tool works. So once I'm happy with what I've marked, I click OK. And you'll see those parts get differentiated on the 3D. And then you'll be able to also name them over here. Expandable. C is spine. All right, and then you'll notice like you basically have a lot of bone to fill in for these spaces. Basically, in here it's going to be a lot of manual work because there's areas of thin bone that I need to fill. Say in this maxilla around the orbits is kind of the biggest areas. So I would go to each of these masks and I would start to use the like maybe in the typical segmentation, the next one would be a smart fill. And if I have like long bones or something like that, where there's like a small hole in the epiphysis of the bone, a radial head or a femur, you can use like fill holes or scapulas, something like that. You can use fill holes, start with a small value and kind of work your way up and look at the 3D and just make sure that the material that it's adding to that part is not in excess of where the actual part boundary is. If you have areas of high concavity, using this fill holes on the smart fill tool will tend to bridge those areas and it may give you spots where it's not really, there's not really bone on the outside. So then your next choice is go to this mark hole tool, in which case it's almost like my mask is a water balloon and there's holes on the outside surface. And my goal is to use this and mark the areas where the edges of that bone are, but it's not marked, it's not filled in. And this is a great tool to do that. One of the best tools to use it for, or the best bones to use it for, is in the sacrum, because the sacrum has a lot of those areas that would get filled in with a general smart fill. But once you paint the areas that are supposed to be closed, it'll fill in the rest of it. So that's your goal there with that tool. And because it's smart, you basically have this two-step brush you can see here, which is like there's a solid circle and a dashed line around that. Whatever you mark inside that solid circle will get filled in for sure. And then whatever's in that dotted circle will get filled in if it's the edge of the bone. So it gives you a little bit of wiggle room there. Is it supposed to fill or is it not? And be aware that it works in 3 dimensions. So if you use a very big circle, but you're close to spots where the bone's not supposed to be, then it could mark too much. And it's not a good idea to mark too much outside the bone because it's harder to clean up. It's better to just paint where you're sure that the bone exists. So from here, it's very helpful to know what the normal shape of the bone is, so I can look at it in 3D and say that's right or that's not right. And here you can use those cortical bone edges as a guide. Here's temporal bone, so there's a lot of spongy area in there that is actually air. I'm not going to fill that. The other helpful tool is using a page up, page down button on the keyboard because that can skip by 10 slices. So you can just show you what that looks like. So that's a good, like, well, let me skip through all the bones and let me try to fill in what's supposed to be solid. So I was using that smart fill on like the big areas of bone that are enclosed. And then I would go back and for the areas of bone that are really thin regions, I won't do the whole thing, but the thin regions, I would go back on multi-slice edit and I would use an ellipse tool of a size of about maybe 4x4. Reason being that if you go to like, you're trying to draw on this thin bone and you draw something that's like not very thick, when you go make a 3D object from that, it might not complete essentially just trying to complete that wall. And if you go too small, it won't make it a solid wall. It'll have holes in it, and that's harder to clean up as well. So I think 4x4 is a decent size to make sure that those gaps get bridged. So as I draw these, I'm skipping slices. But as I scroll through, if I check that auto interpolate is checked off, you'll see that it figures out where it should be marking between those slices, and that shows up in green. And as I scroll through, if there's something that's not filled in, you can do it again. If you notice, I have like one out here, and that could, mess up the interpolation if I have marked, the same area on two slices and going through, and then I forget one, and I mark a different area. You want to make sure that you're consistent in the areas that you're marking through the volume. And then when you're ready, you just click apply. So you can keep doing that for different areas, and you can see them getting filled in on the 3D as well. So what I'll do now is kind of work on either side of the sinus, and I'll just fill those in, and then you can see where that gets filled in on the 3D as well. Skipping those 10 slices. Depends on how thick your slices are, but skipping about 10, you can see where it's getting filled in. And too many for this kind of data set. So you can see right here, it didn't fill it in, so can help it by showing it where to go. And make sure that you mark past each end so that you make sure you're completing whatever kind of thin bone wall you want to complete. This tool is also super useful for doing like vessels, following vessels through a certain area, filling in where they're missed. So you can take a lot more time with filling in thin areas of bone around the orbits, around the maxillary sinuses like I'm doing here. And that'll help the skull be a much higher quality. So really, you should have thin wall all around this orbit. There's basically nothing on the orbital floor here. Line here, you probably have small holes in the sides here where the lacrimal duct exists, and in the back of the in the back of the eye socket where you have the optic nerve going through and the blood supply to the eye. You also have a nasal septum, which is a big wall in the middle of the sinuses. So you can see that partly here. You kind of draw a thin line here. Fill that in. And when you think about 3D printability, you're also thinking like, okay, is there floating pieces in there that can be printed or not? Right, here's another thin area of the skull is the cribriform plate, which is right where, well, above all your, next to all your sinuses, ethmoid sinus, sphenoid sinus are up here. Cribriform plate's like right in the middle of the nose, and so your olfactory nerves go up there. But this is all the solid wall. So that's typically a hard part to segment because it's so thin. All right, so I'm not doing another that. There's another bone up here called the clivus, so that goes up. So you can see small areas like that. All right. Obviously, that can take a lot more time. Once you fill in the areas of thin bone, And you've done basically marking holes, and then for the solid bone, it should be solid. You kind of got them all separated. You can do make sure that they're labeled, final parts. And if you've had previous versions that aren't filled in all the way, it's kind of like in between steps, you could delete those. And then you can right click and do calculate part. That will essentially turn it from marked boxes to a 3D mesh. So that will bring it down here into the tab objects, and notice the difference in the surface quality between a mask and an object. That's your mask. That and the object is smooth in comparison. So we're kind of approximating the surface with triangles instead of with small cubes. That's why you see a slight smoothing effect from there. But here you can see even like the fissures of the skull in there. So it's not smoothing everything out. It's just kind of doing it small amount. The skull base has quite a lot of holes in it, so we want to make sure that we're not filling those in accidentally. But overall, that's pretty good. And you don't have to worry about any like smoothing operations. You don't really have to do any Boolean operations in the segmentation step, because you could do all of those in the 3Matic software, which is more of a CAD package. And from there, you can do a lot more smoothing, filling very small holes in the surfaces, and Boolean subtraction operations, where you might want, well, if you're 3D printing something, you want the meshes to perfectly touch. You don't want gaps between them, because you maybe, support material may get printed in there and not be able to be removed. So you would prefer that to be continuous, which you want to do after you've done all the smoothing and things like that. So that's your intro to Mimics, basic segmentation of new mask, threshold, edit mask to take away big chunks, split mask to separate large pieces of anatomy, basically where bones are separated. We did smart fill to use the either auto filling or marking holes to fill big pieces of bone, or either small holes in the bones. And then finally a fine editing tool, multi-slice edit, where we can fill in thin bones that weren't segmented. All right, thanks for watching.